wind howled like a lost soul around Silas Creed's mountain cabin, scouring snow from the peaks. A lone figure, heavily pregnant and draped in a threadbare shawl, stood swaying on his porch. Silas, axe frozen mid-swing, eyed her warily. "Name's Alara Vance," she gasped, breath frosting in the bitter air. "Saw your notice for a cook." The name struck Silas like a physical blow. The axe slipped from his numb fingers, thudding into the snowpack. Alara. Why did that name stop a man carved from granite dead in his tracks? Silas stared, not at the woman, but through her, the vibrant green of her eyes swallowed by the sudden icy void opening inside him. The name echoed in the hollow space where something precious had once resided, a name he hadn't heard spoken aloud in over a decade. Not since the fever took her. Not since the light went out. The woman, Alara Vance, swayed again, a hand instinctively cradling the swell beneath her worn woolen dress. The journey up the treacherous mountain trail had etched exhaustion deep into her young face, late 20s maybe, though hardship had chiseled premature lines around her eyes. Her boots were cracked, her coat patched at the elbows. Yet beneath the weariness, a fierce determination burned. She met his stunned silence with a steadiness that surprised him, though a flicker of fear danced in her gaze. Had she seen his reaction? Was she already regretting this desperate climb? "Notice said, you needed help," she prompted. Her voice thin but clear, cutting through the wind and his frozen thoughts. "Cooking, cleaning." Silas blinked, forcing himself back to the present, to the biting cold, to the stranger on his porch carrying a ghost's name. He grunted. A rough sound scraped from his throat. "I posted it down at Bitter Creek." He stooped, movement stiff, and retrieved the fallen axe, the worn wood familiar and grounding in his calloused hands. He couldn't look directly at her face yet, not with that name hanging between them like an accusation. "Long way up here for a woman in your condition." A shadow crossed her face. Needed the work, needed a way. Her gaze darted past him, scanning the stark, snow-dusted pines crowding the clearing, the sheer granite faces looming above, looking for pursuit, or just the overwhelming reality of her isolation. Figured mountains were far enough. Silas understood a way. It was why he was here, leagues from town, years from the man he used to be. He studied her again, this Alara Vance, not a ghost, but flesh and blood, vulnerable and stubborn. The baby shifted beneath her hand, a visible ripple under the thin fabric. He saw the tremor she tried to hide. He saw the hunger in her cheeks. "Cold out here," he said finally, the gruffness an attempt to mask the turmoil her name had unleashed. He jerked his head towards the heavy oak door. Inside, he pushed the door open, stepping aside. The warm, smoky scent of pine logs burning in the stone hearth spilled out, a stark contrast to the icy wilderness. Alara hesitated only a second, a brief weariness in her eyes, before the lure of warmth won. She shuffled past him, the scent of snow and something faintly floral, lavender, momentarily displacing the cabin's familiar musk of wood smoke, cured leather and gun oil. Silas followed, closing the heavy door against the keening wind. The cabin was a single large room, ruggedly functional. Rough-hewn log walls, a massive stone fireplace dominating one end, a sturdy plank table and chairs, a rope bed piled high with furs in one corner. Pots and pans hung from pegs near the hearth, a cast-iron stove squatted nearby. Shelves held tins, sacks of flour and beans, jars of preserves. A Winchester leaned against the wall near the door. A skinning knife lay on the table beside a half-whittled piece of pine. It was a place built for survival, not comfort. The only hint of softness was a faded, intricately patterned quilt, folded neatly on a chest beneath the single small window, thick with frost. Alara stood just inside, taking it all in, her shoulders hunched slightly, as if bracing for a blow. She rubbed her hands together, the knuckles red and chapped. The firelight caught the strands of dark hair escaping her braid, framing a face that was all angles and shadows, except for the soft, impossible curve of her pregnancy. She looked impossibly fragile against the cabin's raw strength. Silas moved past her towards the hearth, stirring the embers with an iron poker. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken questions. Why was she alone? Where was the husband whose name she carried? Vance. It meant nothing to him. But Alara, that name resonated in his bones. A mournful chord struck in a long-abandoned room of his heart. He straightened, turning to face her. "Got stew simmering," he said, gesturing towards the black pot hanging over the fire. "You hungry?" It was the most basic offering, but the only safe ground he could find. Her eyes darted to the pot, and a flicker of raw longing crossed her face before she masked it with a careful nod. "Yes, thank you, Mr. Creed," he supplied, the word feeling heavy. Silas Creed. He watched her closely. Did the name mean anything to her? Her expression remained guarded, wary, but held no spark of recognition. Just the weariness, the protective hunch over her unborn child. He ladled stew into a chipped tin bowl and handed it to her, careful not to let their fingers touch. She took it, cradling its warmth. She didn't sit, just stood near the fire, eating with small deliberate bites, her eyes constantly scanning the room, lingering on the door, the window, escape routes. Silas busied himself wiping down the already clean table, the rhythmic motion a poor substitute for the stillness he craved. He could feel the tension radiating from her, a coiled spring ready to snap. What had she run from? What danger followed her up this mountain? And why, in God's name, did she have that name? He risked a glance. She'd finished the stew, holding the empty bowl. Her gaze met his, less fearful now, but still deeply uncertain. "The work, Mr. Creed. When would you?" Silas cleared his throat, the sound harsh in the quiet cabin. The name still echoed. Alara. He couldn't bring himself to say it aloud again. Not yet. It felt like prying open a grave. "Tomorrow," he said, his voice rougher than intended. He turned abruptly to hang the ladle back on its hook, staring into the flames. "Get your strength back first." He paused, then added, the words feeling like stones dragged from a deep well. "There's a lean-to out back, clean, dry. You can bunk there tonight, separate." He heard her soft intake of breath, relief warring with a new kind of apprehension. Separate quarters were a practical necessity, a boundary he desperately needed. But the way he'd said it, the sudden aversion in his tone when he avoided using her name, he knew she'd heard it. He felt her eyes on his back, questioning, sensing the jagged edge of the unspoken thing that lay between them, colder and sharper than the mountain wind outside. The mystery of his shock was now a tangible presence in the room, as heavy and unsettling as the winter pressing against the walls. The wind, a constant companion on the mountain, found new crevices to moan through around the lean-to. Alara lay wrapped in the surprisingly clean, if coarse, wool blanket Silas had provided, listening to its mournful song. Inside the main cabin, only silence. Was Silas Creed awake too, haunted by the same unspoken tension that crackled in the air after he'd all but fled her presence? Her name. It was always her name. She'd seen the shock, the raw pain that had flashed across his granite features before he'd shuddered it away. Alara. What ghosts did it conjure for him, and what did it mean for her, trapped in this frozen sanctuary with a man who flinched at the sound of her? Morning bled gray light through the lean-to's small ice-fringed window. Every muscle protested as Alara pushed herself up, the baby a heavy, insistent weight low in her belly. Survival, that was the only thought that mattered. She needed this work, this roof. Steeling herself, she smoothed her worn dress, re-braided her dark hair with fingers stiff from cold, and pushed open the lean-to door. The main cabin door was already open. Silas stood just outside, his broad back to her, splitting logs with rhythmic, powerful swings of the axe. The sharp crack echoed in the still, frosty air, each blow seeming to release a fraction of the tension coiled within him. He didn't turn as she approached, but his shoulders stiffened almost imperceptibly. She paused on the porch, the weathered boards creaking under her weight. "Mr. Creed." Her voice was tentative, cutting through the rhythmic chopping. The axe halted mid-swing. He lowered it slowly, turning. His gaze swept over her, lingering for a fraction of a second on her rounded belly before meeting her eyes. The haunted look from the previous evening was banked, replaced by his usual guarded stoicism, but a new wariness lingered in the lines around his eyes. "Ma'am," he acknowledged, his breath pluming white. "The work," she prompted, clasping her chilled hands. "Where would you have me start?" He jerked his head towards the cabin interior. "Fire needs tending. Kettle's on the hob. Reckon breakfast could be managed." He avoided her name again, the omission loud in the crisp air. Inside, the cabin held the residual warmth of the banked fire. Alara moved with careful purpose, stoking the embers into flame, filling the heavy iron kettle from the water bucket near the door. The simple axe, the scrape of the iron poker, the slosh of water, felt grounding. She inventoried the sparse supplies, sacks of beans and flour, salt pork wrapped in cloth, a few withered root vegetables in a bin, basic hearty mountain fare. Silas remained outside, the steady thwack of the axe resuming, a counterpoint to her quiet movements inside. She found a sack of coarse cornmeal and set about making mush, the simple task requiring concentration that pushed her anxieties aside. As the mixture thickened over the fire, releasing a warm, grainy scent, she noticed Silas pause outside the window. He wasn't looking in, head bowed, one large hand resting on the axe handle, lost in thought or memory. The sight sent a fresh prickle of unease down her spine. What was he remembering? He entered, as she was spooning the steaming mush into 2 chipped bowls. He stopped just inside the door, his presence momentarily blocking the light. His eyes swept the room, landing on the bowls, then flickering to her face. Something shifted in his expression, not warmth, exactly, but a flicker of surprise perhaps at the simple orderliness, the unexpected domesticity. He grunted, a sound that could have meant anything, and moved to the table. They ate in silence, the only sounds the scrape of spoons and the crackle of the fire. Alara ate slowly, forcing down the bland food, her senses heightened, every creak of the cabin settling, every gust of wind rattling the door latch, made her muscles tense. Was it just the mountain's voice, or something else? She found her gaze drifting constantly to the small window, scanning the snow-dusted pines beyond the clearing. Silas finished first, pushing his bowl away. He watched her, his gaze thoughtful, lingering on the way her free hand instinctively cradled her belly, as she leaned forward to take another spoonful. "You manage all right, with," he gestured vaguely towards her middle, the words awkward. Alara met his eyes, seeing not judgment, but a gruff, practical concern. "I manage, Mr. Creed," she said, her voice firmer than she felt. "Always have." A shadow crossed her face, fleeting but sharp. "Until I couldn't." She didn't voice it, but the unspoken fear hung between them, the fear that had driven her up this mountain. Later, while Silas meticulously cleaned his rifle near the hearth, Alara tackled the pile of mending he'd indicated. Shirts with frayed cuffs, socks worn thin at the heel. She sat by the window, the weak afternoon light falling on her work. As she pushed the needle through tough denim, her hand brushed against a small, faded patch, sewn onto the inside of a shirt cuff. It was a simple embroidered wildflower, its colors muted, but the stitching delicate, precise. A woman's touch. Silas, glancing up from his task, froze, his gaze locked onto the patch in her hands. The rag he'd been using to oil the rifle slipped from his fingers, landing with a soft thud on the packed earth floor. His face went utterly still, the color draining slightly beneath his weathered tan. He stared at the patch, as if it were a ghost, his knuckles white, where he gripped the rifle stock. Alara's breath hitched. She hadn't meant to intrude. It was loose. "I was just," she stammered, quickly setting the shirt aside, the tiny flower, feeling suddenly like a burning coal. He didn't speak for a long moment. Then, with visible effort, he bent, retrieved the rag, and resumed his cleaning, his movements stiff, mechanical. The silence thickened, charged with the weight of whatever memory that small embroidered flower had unleashed. The afternoon wore on, heavy with unspoken things. Alara finished the mending, her movements subdued. Silas sharpened his skinning knife, the rhythmic scrape of stone on steel, the only sound besides the wind. As dusk began to stain the snow purple, Silas stood abruptly. "Gotta check the perimeter," he stated, his voice tight. "Check the snares." He pulled on his heavy coat, took his rifle, and without another word, shouldered open the door, disappearing into the gathering gloom. Alara watched him go, a knot of apprehension tightening in her chest. The cabin felt vast and empty without him, yet the memory of his reaction to the embroidered flower filled the space. Who had sewn it? Another Alara, her namesake, and what had happened to her? The mountain man's pain was a tangible thing, a presence as real as the cold seeping under the door. Moving to the small window, she peered out into the twilight. Silas was a dark, purposeful shape, moving towards the tree line at the edge of the clearing. He paused, scanning the woods, rifle held ready. Then, just as he was about to step into the shadows of the pines, he stopped dead. He crouched low, his head tilted, staring intently at something on the ground near the base of a large spruce. Alara squinted, her heart pounding against her ribs. What had he seen? Tracks? Something out of place in the pristine snow. Silas stayed frozen in that crouch for a long, tense moment. Then, slowly, deliberately, he raised his head, not to look deeper into the woods, but to turn his gaze directly back towards the cabin, towards the window where she stood. Even through the fading light and the frost-rimed glass, Alara felt the intensity of his stare, saw the grim set of his jaw. It wasn't just vigilance in his eyes now, it was warning. The peaceful isolation of the mountain had just fractured, and the cold dread that had chased her up the trail coiled tightly in her gut once more. Something or someone had left its mark too close to Silas Creed's sanctuary, too close to hers. The wind snatched Silas Creed's breath as he crouched, the fading light leaching color from the world, leaving only stark grays and deepening blues. His gaze, locked for that chilling moment, with Alara's wide eyes through the cabin window, now dropped back to the snow. Just beyond the protective ring of pines bordering the clearing, near the gnarled base of an ancient spruce, the pristine white was marred. Not an animal track. Too large, too deliberate. A single, deep boot print, sharp-edged and fresh, pointing towards the cabin. Beside it, the snow was disturbed, scuffed, as if someone had stood there, shifting weight, watching. Silas's hand tightened on the cold steel of his flintlock rifle. Company. Uninvited, unwelcome. He moved with the silent, predatory grace of a man who knew every inch of his territory. He skirted the print, eyes scanning the surrounding snow, the darkening tree line. No other tracks led away. Either the visitor had backtracked meticulously, covering their trail, unlikely in the fading light, or they were still nearby, watching. The thought sent a cold prickle down his spine that had nothing to do with the dropping temperature. Near the scuffed snow, something glinted dully. Silas knelt, brushing aside loose powder, a cheap, dented tobacco tin, its painted label worn almost bare. He flipped it open. Empty, except for the faint, acrid smell of cheap shag. He turned it over in his gloved hand. Scratched crudely into the bottom metal were two initials. JD. The letters meant nothing to Silas. No one from his past, no trapper or prospector he knew, used those initials. Relief warred with fresh unease. Not tied to his ghosts then, but whose? His gaze flickered back towards the cabin window. Alara Vance. Her fear, her constant vigilance. It suddenly felt less like paranoia and more like prescience. Inside, Alara stood frozen at the window, her knuckles white where she gripped the rough sill. Silas's warning stare had been like a physical blow. The peaceful rhythm of the day, the quiet mending, the shared meal, shattered. He was out there, investigating whatever had ripped that hole in their fragile sanctuary. He, not an animal. He. The dread she'd carried up the mountain, the dread she'd momentarily shelved in the face of Silas's gruff decency, surged back, thick and suffocating. She pressed a hand against the hard swell of her belly. Protect you, she silently promised the life within. I will. The cabin door banged open, admitting a blast of frigid air, and Silas, his broad shoulders dusted with snow. He shut the door swiftly, bolting it with a heavy thud that echoed in the sudden silence. His face was grim, etched with new lines in the firelight. He didn't look at her immediately, striding instead to the hearth, holding his hands out to the flames. The chill radiating from him seemed deeper than the mountain cold. Alara found her voice, thin and strained. What What was it? Silas finally turned. His eyes, shadowed and intense, met hers. Tracks, he said, flatly. Man-sized, fresh. He pulled the dented tobacco tin from his coat pocket and tossed it onto the table. It skittered across the rough wood. Found this. Alara's breath hitched. She approached the table slowly, as if the tin might bite. She picked it up, her fingers tracing the crude JD etched into the metal. A strangled sound escaped her lips. Half gasp, half sob. She dropped the tin as if burned, taking a stumbling step back, her face ashen. No, she whispered, shaking her head. Not here. He can't, he wouldn't. Silas moved closer, his presence suddenly a solid wall between her and the door. Who wouldn't? Alara. The name slipped out, raw and unavoidable in the charged air. He saw her flinch at its sound, but his gaze was unwavering, demanding. Who are you running from? The directness, the use of her name, broke something inside her. Tears welled, spilling over despite her fierce effort to hold them back. His name is Jedediah Dawes, she choked out, the words tasting like ash. He wasn't my husband. My husband died. Dawes, he claimed a debt, said I belonged to him to settle it. She wrapped her arms protectively around herself, shuddering. He wouldn't let go. He has a temper, a bad one. She didn't elaborate, but the terror in her eyes, the way her hand instinctively flew to a faint faded bruise near her temple, spoke volumes. I thought the mountains, I thought I was finally free. Jedediah Dawes, JD. The pieces clicked with grim finality. Silas stared at her. This woman bearing a ghost's name, carrying another man's child, fleeing a brute who tracked her like prey. The protective urge that had been quietly growing within him surged, fierce and primal. He saw the embroidered wildflower patch she'd set aside earlier, a relic of a gentle past, a stark contrast to the ugliness she described. His Alara, she'd loved wildflowers too. A memory surfaced, unbidden, a sun-drenched meadow, laughter, a small hand placing a bluebell behind his ear. Pretty, she'd whispered, like your eyes. Then the image shattered, replaced by the rasp of her breath in the sick room, the desperate grip of her hand as the fever took her. I'm sorry, Silas, couldn't. The rest was lost to the roaring grief. He blinked, forcing the memory down. Different women, different tragedies, but both named Alara, both caught in life's cruel snare. A sudden ferocious gust of wind slammed against the cabin, rattling the door in its frame. The oil lamp flickered wildly. Outside, the moan of the wind had risen to a shriek. The storm, brewing all day, had arrived with savage intent. Silas moved swiftly. Blizzard, he stated, the word heavy with new danger. He grabbed an oilcloth slicker from a peg. I need to secure the lean-to. Stockpile more wood by the door. Stay here. Bolt this behind me. He paused, his hand on the latch, his gaze locked onto hers, fierce and unwavering. No one gets in, Alara. You hear me? No one. He plunged back into the maelstrom. Alara rushed to bolt the door, her heart hammering against her ribs. Through the small window, she saw Silas battling the wind, a dark shape wrestling with the lean-to's door, then heaving armfuls of split logs into a pile near the cabin wall. Snow swirled around him like a living thing, erasing the world beyond the clearing. He stumbled back inside, minutes later, coated in snow, his breath ragged. Can't see 10 feet, he gasped, slamming the bolt home. Trails buried. Anyone out there? He didn't finish, but the implication hung heavy. If Jedediah Dawes was out in this, he was either desperate or already too close. They worked in tense silence. Silas banked the fire high. Alara filled every available container with water from the bucket. The wind screamed, an unearthly sound that seemed to shake the very foundations of the cabin. The single lamp cast long dancing shadows that felt menacing. Alara jumped at every creak, every groan of timber. Hours crawled by. The storm's fury showed no sign of abating. Huddled near the fire, wrapped in a thick fur, Alara watched Silas clean his rifle again, his movements methodical, a ritual of readiness. The shared fear, the isolation enforced by the blizzard, created an odd intimacy. He didn't look at the wildflower patch. He didn't speak of his past. but when he handed her a cup of hot bitter chicory without a word, his hand brushing hers briefly, it felt like an anchor in the chaos. Suddenly, Silas froze, head cocked, his eyes narrowed, fixed not on the door, but on the wall shared with the lean-to. Alara held her breath, straining to hear over the wind's shriek. Then she heard it too, a distinct heavy thump against the lean-to's outer wall. Not the wind, something solid. Silas was on his feet in an instant, rifle raised, his body coiled like a spring. He motioned sharply for Alara to get behind him, his gaze locked on the cabin door, leading towards the lean-to. His finger hovered near the trigger. The blizzard screamed. What? Beneath it, the silence inside the cabin was absolute, charged with the terrifying question, what had just hit the wall? The heavy thump against the lean-to wall reverberated through the cabin's silence, sharper than the blizzard's shriek. Silas Creed stood rigid, rifle stock pressed hard into his shoulder, finger taut on the trigger, eyes narrowed to lethal slits fixed on the internal door, leading to the lean-to. Alara pressed herself against the rough log wall behind him, one hand clamped over her mouth, the other instinctively cradling the frantic flutter beneath her ribs. The storm howled, a mad beast tearing at the world, but inside the only sound was the frantic drumming of Alara's heart and Silas's low, controlled breathing. Not the wind. The impact had been too solid, too localized. Silas took a single, silent step towards the connecting door, his body coiled like a mountain cat's. He motioned sharply with his free hand. Stay down. Alara slid to the floor, her back against the cold logs, grabbing the heavy cast-iron poker from the hearth. Its weight was cold and solid in her trembling hand. She watched Silas, a dark silhouette against the firelight, his focus absolute. He reached for the heavy iron latch on the lean-to door. With a sudden explosive movement, he yanked the door open, rifle swinging to cover the space beyond. Icy wind and a swirl of snow blasted into the main cabin, extinguishing one of the oil lamps and making the fire gutter wildly. Silas peered into the gloom of the lean-to, illuminated only by the flickering light spilling from behind him. Alara held her breath, poker raised, ready to swing. She saw Silas tense, then relax marginally. He lowered the rifle barrel an inch, his posture shifting from attack to wary assessment. Storm, he growled, his voice barely audible over the wind's roar. He stepped partially into the lean-to, bracing against the gale. Tree, limb, came down on the roof corner, tore some shingles. Alara sagged with momentary relief, the poker clattering softly beside her. Not Jedediah, not yet, but the reprieve was cold comfort. The lean-to, her fragile sanctuary, was breached. Snow swirled violently inside its small space, dusting her meager belongings. The wind screamed through the new gap in the roof like a vengeful spirit. Silas wrestled the connecting door shut against the wind's force, re-engaging the heavy iron bolt. He turned, his face grim, etched with new urgency. Roofs damaged, winds getting under it, whole corner could go. He scanned the main cabin's ceiling beams, his gaze calculating, need to shore it from inside. Now, he moved with swift efficiency, ignoring the snow melting on his shoulders. Dragging the heavy oak table towards the threatened corner, he gestured for Alara to clear the area. Get the bedrolls, anything loose, away from here. His voice was clipped, focused solely on the immediate danger. Alara scrambled to obey, her movements awkward but determined. She dragged the buffalo robe and her few belongings towards the hearth, her breath coming in short gasps, the baby a heavy, protesting weight. She watched Silas heave a thick support beam, normally used for hanging game, onto the table. He positioned it diagonally, bracing it against the ceiling joist above the weakened corner. The wind slammed against the cabin, and the damaged section groaned ominously. Silas hammered a wooden wedge between the beam and the joist with the butt of his axe, the sharp crack echoing in the tense space. As he secured the brace, his coat sleeve snagged on a protruding nail near the cabin wall. With a sharp tug, the fabric tore. Something small and metallic flew from an inner pocket, landing with a soft clink on the packed earth floor near Alara's feet. She bent, wincing at the strain, and picked it up. It was a locket, tarnished silver, oval, warm from being carried close to his skin. It felt fragile, precious. Before she could think, her thumb found the tiny catch. It sprang open. Inside, protected by thin glass, were two miniature portraits. One was of a much younger Silas, his face less lined, his eyes holding a warmth she'd never seen. The other, Elara's breath caught. The woman had dark hair like hers, eyes a similar shade of green, but her features were softer, her smile gentle and open. And beneath the portrait, in tiny faded script, "Elara is Elara." Silas turned, wiping sweat and snowmelt from his brow. He saw the open locket in Elara's hand. All movement ceased. The color drained from his face, replaced by a raw, naked pain that stripped away the years of stoicism. For a heartbeat, the howling storm, the damaged roof, the threat of Jedediah Dawes, everything ceased to exist. There was only the locket, the ghost in the portrait, and the living woman holding it. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The agony in his eyes, the way his hand trembled slightly as he reached out, told the story his gruff silence never could. "I'm sorry," Elara whispered, her voice trembling. She snapped the locket shut, its soft click sounding final in the sudden stillness. She held it out to him, her own eyes wide with understanding and a profound aching sorrow. "She was beautiful. You loved her." Silas took the locket, his calloused fingers brushing hers. He closed his fist around it, the metal biting into his palm, a physical anchor against the tidal wave of grief. He met Elara's gaze, the shared name hanging between them, a bridge of loss and unexpected kinship. "Fever," he rasped, the single word scraped raw from his throat. "Took her, and the child." He looked away, towards the fire, unable to bear the compassion in her eyes. Years ago, the confession, brief and brutal, hung in the air. The storm raged, the damaged roof groaned under another assault of wind, but a fragile thread of understanding had been woven. Elara saw the depth of the wound her name had reopened. Silas saw the echo of vulnerability in this stranger, who shared his ghost's name, and now carried her own child into danger. Suddenly, Silas stiffened. His head snapped up, not towards the roof, but towards the cabin's main door. His hunter's senses, momentarily dulled by emotion and the storm's cacophony, had caught something else. A sound beneath the wind's shriek, not wood straining, not the crackle of the fire, a scraping, metal on wood. Near the door latch, Elara saw the change in him, the instant transformation back to lethal alertness. Her blood ran cold. She clutched the poker again, her knuckles white. Silas moved like shadow, gliding silently to the side of the heavy door, pressing his back against the logs. He raised the rifle, his finger finding the trigger, his eyes locked on the latch. The scraping came again, deliberate, persistent. Someone was outside, trying the bolt, trying to get in. The wind screamed, the fire popped, the scraping sound ceased. Then, a voice, distorted by the gale, but chillingly clear, sliced through the chaos. "Elara Vance, I know you're in there. Open this door, girl. Time to settle accounts." Jedediah Dawes had weathered the storm. He was here, and the flimsy wooden door was all that stood between Elara and the man who believed she belonged to him. Silas Creed's finger tightened on the trigger, his gaze locking with Elara's terrified eyes. The sanctuary had been breached, the ghosts confronted. Now, the reckoning was at the door. Jedediah Dawes's voice, rough and demanding, cut through the blizzard's shriek like a rusty blade. "Elara Vance, open this door, girl. Time to settle accounts." Inside the cabin, the air crackled with lethal tension. Silas Creed remained pressed against the logs beside the door, rifle unwavering, his gaze locked on the heavy latch where the scraping had been. His jaw was granite, his eyes chips of obsidian reflecting the guttering firelight. Behind him, Elara gripped the cast-iron poker, her knuckles white, her breath shallow and fast. The baby kicked violently, a frantic drumbeat against her ribs, mirroring her terror. The latch rattled violently. A heavy thud slammed against the thick oak door, shaking the frame. Dawes was trying to force it, his strength amplified by desperation or rage. Snow whistled through the gaps around the jamb. "He'll break it," Elara gasped, the poker trembling in her hands. Silas didn't flinch. His voice, when it came, was a low, dangerous growl meant only for her. "Get back, against the far wall, now." His eyes flickered towards the damaged roof corner, braced precariously. "If he gets in, aim for his legs. Don't hesitate." Another thunderous blow shook the door. The iron bolt groaned. Silas took a half-step back, planting his feet, the rifle stock snug against his shoulder. His finger tightened imperceptibly on the trigger. He drew a slow, deliberate breath, the world narrowing to the door, the weapon, and the predator outside. Crack. The top hinge splintered. With a final enraged heave, Jedediah Dawes burst through the shattered doorway in a whirlwind of snow and fury. He was a bear of a man, thick-necked and broad-shouldered, his face raw from the cold and twisted with malice, a heavy revolver clutched in his gloved fist. His eyes, small and piggish, scanned the dim interior, landing instantly on Elara cowering near the hearth. "There you are, you little," Dawes snarled, raising his pistol. Boom! Silas's flintlock rifle roared, the sound deafening in the confined space. Smoke billowed. Dawes bellowed, stumbling back, clutching his right shoulder where the heavy lead ball had torn through coat and flesh. His revolver clattered to the floorboards. Blood bloomed dark on the worn wool. "You son of a," Dawes roared, pain and fury contorting his face. He lunged, not for his gun, but towards Silas, a knife flashing in his left hand. Silas, already moving, used the rifle like a club, swinging the heavy stock. It connected with Dawes's temple with a sickening thud. The big man staggered, dazed, but didn't go down. He slammed into Silas, driving him back against the table supporting the roof brace. The makeshift structure shuddered ominously. Elara saw her chance. Fear was a cold fire in her veins, but the instinct to protect her child burned hotter. Dawes's back was to her, his focus entirely on grappling with Silas. She surged forward, the heavy poker raised high with both hands. With a cry that was part terror, part fury, she brought it down with all her strength onto the back of Dawes's knee. He screamed, a high-pitched sound of pure agony, his leg buckling. His grip on Silas slackened. Silas shoved hard, sending Dawes sprawling backwards, crashing into the damaged section of the wall beneath the braced roof corner. The impact jarred the support beam. The wooden wedge Silas had hammered in popped loose. Dawes looked up, dazed, bleeding, just as the wind unleashed a ferocious gust. The damaged corner of the roof, deprived of its key support, groaned like a dying beast. With a rending crash of splintering wood and tearing shingles, a section of roof and wall collapsed inward, burying Jedediah Dawes under a cascade of heavy timber, snow and debris. A final, choked gasp was swallowed by the howling wind and the settling wreckage. Then, silence, save for the storm raging through the new gaping hole. Silas stood panting, staring at the pile of rubble where Dawes lay buried and still. Snow swirled violently into the cabin through the opening. Elara dropped the poker, her legs giving way as reaction set in. She sank to her knees near the hearth, trembling uncontrollably, one hand pressed protectively over her belly. Silas was at her side in an instant, kneeling beside her, his hands hovering, unsure. "Elara, are you hurt?" The name came freely now, stripped of its earlier pain, filled only with urgent concern. She shook her head, unable to speak, tears streaming down her face, tears of terror, relief, and overwhelming exhaustion. She looked up at him, her green eyes wide in the firelight. He's gone," Silas stated flatly, his gaze flicking to the rubble. "Storm finished it." He didn't mourn, he saw only the threat extinguished. He looked back at her, his expression softening minutely. "The baby?" "Kicking," she managed, a shaky breath escaping her. Strong, it felt like a defiance, a promise. Silas nodded, a flicker of something like awe in his eyes. He rose, moving swiftly. The cabin was freezing rapidly, snow piling in through the hole. He grabbed the heavy buffalo robe and wrapped it around Elara's shaking shoulders. He then dragged the shattered door as best he could across the main entrance, piling sacks of grain and firewood against it to block the worst of the wind and snow from that direction. The gaping hole in the corner was a bigger problem. He positioned the table on its side as a partial windbreak, and piled every blanket and fur knot around Ilara against it, creating a fragile barrier. He worked tirelessly, the storm still howling outside, but its fury seemed lessened now that the immediate human threat was gone. Finally, when the cold was marginally held at bay, he returned to Ilara. He built the fire higher, the flames casting dancing light on their faces. He filled a tin mug with hot water from the kettle hanging over the coals and handed it to her. His hand brushed hers, warm and steady. "Drink," he said quietly. Slowly, she sipped the hot water, the warmth spreading through her, calming the tremors. She watched him as he sat on the hearthstones nearby, his rifle resting across his knees, his gaze occasionally scanning the barricaded openings, ever vigilant. The lines of grief around his eyes were still there, but they seemed less like chasms now, more like weathered marks on stone. "You're Ilara," Ilara whispered, her voice raw. "And your child. I'm so sorry, Silas." He looked into the flames, the reflection dancing in his dark eyes. "Long time ago," he said, his voice low and rough, "buried that pain deep. Too deep." He paused, then looked directly at her. "But her name, it weren't just pain, it was all the good too. The light." He gestured vaguely around the cabin, then his gaze settled on her rounded belly. "Life finds a way, even up here." Ilara understood. He wasn't replacing his lost love, he was acknowledging that her name, once a wound, could also be a bridge, a reminder that light and life could return, even to the loneliest mountain. As the first gray light of dawn began to seep through the storm clouds, the wind finally started to lessen its furious assault. The blizzard was passing. Silas rose, checking the barricades. He peered through a gap in the snow-choked hole where the wall had been. The clearing was a pristine deep white, the pines heavy with snow. The mountain stood silent, majestic, cleansed. He turned back to Ilara. She had drifted into an exhausted sleep near the fire, wrapped in the buffalo robe, one hand resting gently on her belly. The lines of fear and weariness had smoothed from her face, replaced by a fragile peace. Silas Creed stood watch. He watched the sleeping woman who shared his ghost's name. He watched the slow, steady rise and fall beneath the fur that spoke of the new life sheltered within her. He watched the dawn slowly brighten the ravaged cabin. The storm had passed, the threat was buried, the mountain, and the man who lived upon it, had weathered it. He picked up his axe. There was a hole in his wall to mend, a roof to repair. There was work to be done, and for the first time in a very long time, the work felt like more than just survival. It felt like a beginning. He settled himself by the fire, rifle across his lap, keeping watch over Ilara Vance and the future stirring within her, as the new day broke cold and clear over the snow-drenched peaks.